Okay. So this morning, I was wondering if you could talk a little about attachment aversion and the election, which we're on the eve of, and everyone's very, I think, anxious about.
I understand. Yes, exactly. So, okay, let's just think we're here to talk a little bit about these things, about these attitudes, about the views, Buddha's views, about how to live our lives. And this is a perfect opportunity. So let's have a look at this. I mean, it's fairly clear, isn't it? I mean, the more as we talk all the time, we can really see, that attachment in us, even if it's fairly mild, even if it doesn't even feel very strong, wants things to be the way we want. It's kind of really, really simple. We want it to turn out the way we want it. That's it, I mean, what happens is, of course, we put lots of logical reasons onto that, because the next thing is we then think we're right, we then get fanatic. So that's when the attachment's very strong. And so the anxiety is because the people in this case who are voting for Mr. Trump are really scared that he won't win. And the people who want to vote for Kamala Harris are really scared that she won't win. And it looks so close, Everybody's jumping in all the projections of what's going to happen. And so, of course, it's people have panic attacks, But it's whether it's, not getting your breakfast the same way, whether it's terrified of a war going to happen, whether it's dying tomorrow, it comes down to the same thing every single time. I mean, it almost seems too simple, doesn't it? It almost seems too simple. But the key to success, the key to keeping our sanity, no matter what happens, is to work on the mind. There's just no choice, because we can't get what we want in the end all the time, no matter what happens. We can't. We know that. So this, of course, doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. We should have a valid reason to say we really think something terrible is going to happen, and you can try and stop it. Well, wonderful, do that. But don't guarantee it'll happen, Don't guarantee that you'll get what you want. This is the one that it really does seem very simple. It really does seem very too easy, just too simple as an explanation, But it's a fact. This is the Buddhist teaching, and it's kind of incredible. So no matter what happens, this is the thing. People, I mean, sometimes the fear is so intense, we just believe we couldn't bear the result we don't want. People literally live in fear of some results, and almost go mad at the thought of it. But the fact of the matter is we're capable. I mean, that's why for me, examples of people who go to prison, there you are, or something shocking happens one day. There you are living an ordinary life, and all of a sudden something happens and they send you off to prison. I mean, somehow if we're capable of changing our mind, and we're capable of adjusting ourselves to deal with that new situation. But the level to which it's painful is, of course, the level to which we've got this attachment to get what we want. I mean, it's such an interesting explanation, but if we can hear it, it's every day. This is what practice is. And as I say, you don't wait till the terrible thing happens. You don't wait till, someone wants to murder you. You don't wait till you want to murder somebody else. You don't wait till the really bad thing to happen. You work on it every day. You work on it every single day, I mean, that's the essence. I tell you, this is daily practice. That's it. They took 5 minutes, 4 minutes. I'm going to talk for 90 minutes on that. I don't think so. So what date is it today? The 4th. But I mean, people are voting already, aren't they? People are voting already, aren't they? So when they just have to be voted, when do you have to finish your vote in? When does your vote have to be in?
Tomorrow.
Has to be in by tomorrow.
Yeah. Except, I mean, some are absentee ballots and mail-in ballots that I'm not sure how that all gets processed. I think everything has to be dated by tomorrow.
Tomorrow, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And how many people vote? 'Cause I saw something like 60 million have voted already. How many? Only about 50% of Americans vote, don't they? It's
Yeah.
interesting. I know there's a law in Australia has always been there, and people just abide by it. It's illegal not to vote, so everybody always votes. Maybe 1% of people never vote, and they get fined, but it doesn't ever seem to have much effect. People all seem to vote. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, so this is it. This is the essence of it, people. This is the essence of it. You have attachment. But I mean, the thing is, it sounds easy when you say attachment, but actually it's incredibly difficult because it goes to incredibly subtle levels. I mean, like I say, you don't really give up all the delusions totally until you've realized emptiness. we can do an enormous amount of work. We can progress incredibly. And you can even get bodhicitta, you know, before you realize emptiness. So we can be pretty advanced. But until we've given up emptiness, there's always going to be the imprints, the tendency for these delusions, you know. And see, this is an important point too. If we do study most of us might not study the Dharma very much. And we hear about bodhicitta and we hear about realizing emptiness. These are the essence of the two wings of the bird, actually. So, you know, you could say that they say that compassion, which leads to bodhicitta, is what causes you to get enlightened. But you can't do it without wisdom. You can be the highest level bodhisattva, and to a certain degree of a level of bodhicitta, you can still lose. You can still lose it. So, but then on the other hand, realizing emptiness without bodhicitta, that's not enough either. And that's why we've got to understand these different stages of practice. All the so-called wisdom wing is all the practices related to karma and the mind, you know, and understanding emptiness. They're all the wisdom wing. They're all the nuts and bolts of the work we do on our mind to rid the mind of delusions. That's getting wisdom, quite literally. And then there's the work on the basis of that, of learning to give up self-cherishing, give up selfishness, practice love, compassion, great compassion, and get bodhicitta. It's a whole different type of practice. They're completely different, actually, but one helps the other. It's really obvious. But when we've got to understand this, you know, the developing of wisdom, which brings your happiness, your clarity, your joy, your freedom from suffering. That's what they mean by the wisdom wing. And that's absolutely necessary. And that's giving up attachment, giving up aversion, giving up the fears, giving up the delusions, eventually giving up grasping at this concrete me, you know. All of that's the wisdom wing. All of that's the work we need to do on ourself that brings our results. That's the way to say it. It brings our results. It brings our freedom from suffering. It brings our happiness. It brings everything for us. And then, on the basis of this, we practice equanimity, we practice having compassion, we practice developing love, which all culminates in bodhicitta. So they're two completely different approaches to practice, you know, and they're very different, very specific and very different practices. So it's really important to understand this. It's really important to understand this, you know. And of course, in any one day, you know, you've got to really, in a sense, we've got this toolkit. If we know the teachings, if we understand the teachings, we have this toolkit that we can then apply when necessary. You know, so like you say, for example, one day you suddenly have to practice being patient with somebody. That's the compassion wing. Another day you practice refraining from anger. That's actually the wisdom wing. You know, you've got to be very clear about each different type of practice. And they're all, of course, psychological. They're all the mind. And of course, the point is too, every time you practice the wisdom wing, that helps you practice the compassion wing, and vice versa. Every time they each help the other. But you've got to have both, you know. And the real point about getting compassion, of course, we can have tremendous compassion at certain levels. But the compassion we tend to have that we recognize, you know, is compassion for the people who are poor and sick and struggling. That's a pretty amazing level of compassion, but that's only a very small percentage of beings, you know. Everybody. So we've got to understand that's why, in order to really develop the compassion that Buddhism talks about, the level of compassion that we can cultivate, which is compassion for everybody, including the rich and the beautiful and the famous and the evil, the bad people, the crazies, the troublemakers, the liars, the thieves, the murderers, the rapists, the warmongers. We can see in the world there are many people who do terrible harm to others. There's no question. So our compassion has to include them. So then, of course, on the face of it, for most of us, that gets us puzzled because we think, why would I have compassion for them? Because we have a very strong impulse to think that compassion is only for the people who are the victims, only for the people who are sick or poor, or having a hard time, So in order to understand then how we can get compassion for everybody, we have to do the wisdom wing. It's very simple. And that means we have to do the most basic practice, the most basic teaching is the Four Noble Truths, Buddha's very first teaching. It's right there that he explains what he means by suffering, So in order to have compassion, so what compassion is, compassion really starts with the thought, may you not suffer. So if we have in our mind that suffering refers only to the victims and the poor people and the sick people, or the animals who get hurt by humans and things like that, then of course when we only have compassion when we see them. But if we're walking down the street and we see a poor person, we'll have compassion. If we're walking down the street and we see a rich, beautiful person who looks very arrogant, the first instinct is not to have compassion for them. So we've got to look at that. We've got to understand that. That's limited. So then we have to, if I'm going to have compassion for everybody, I've got to know what suffering is, because compassion is your response to seeing suffering. So that means we've got to really look carefully at what we mean by suffering. So we go right back to the very first level of teachings in the wisdom wing, and we look at the Four Noble Truths. So this is Buddha's first teaching. It's the way he presented his findings from his own experience about reality, about the world. So he framed it all in terms of suffering. So the first one is there is suffering. The second one is there are causes of that suffering. The third one is you can be free of that suffering and those causes. And four, how to do it. So obviously he's talking to us. He's talking to us. He's not saying your mother's suffering. We're not discussing other people here. This is not the compassion wing. This is the wisdom wing. So it's Buddha explaining to us what suffering is and so on. So therefore, the very first one then we ask, what is suffering? Well, he will tell us straight away, there are 3 levels of suffering. The first one, he calls it the suffering of suffering. Very simple. And that's the one we understand. That's the one we understand immediately. The bad things happening, poor people. So we're talking to ourselves, right? Forget other people. We're talking about ourselves right now. So he's telling us, the very first level we suffer is when bad things happen. So we look into our lives and we compare different situations in our life, and we know that we would call some of them happiness and we would call some of them suffering. So then we think, okay, that's interesting. I am suffering. Yes, bad things happen. But then he tells us there's a subtler level of suffering. And it's a bit shocking initially because it's what we call happiness. So and then there's a third level of suffering before we even go to that one, which is even more subtle. Let's look at these two, because these two.
Venerable, you're frozen. We've lost you. I don't know if she can hear me. Let's see if I can send her a text. Oh, she's gone. Okay, I guess she knows. Here she comes. You're muted.
Can you see me again?
Yes, yes, there you are. Okay,
It's
welcome
not
back.
very strong. The house that I'm in here at the Institute is not very strong Wi-Fi. I'm sorry, it might just go again. So let's look at the Four Noble Truths, like I said, Four Noble Truths. So in the Four Noble Truths, if we go to the second one, and Buddha tells us about the causes of suffering, okay? Because obviously, if you want to get rid of suffering, whatever you call it, you have to know what causes it. It's very clear, isn't it, that if you have a problem, until you know what caused it, you can never find the solution. So it's a very logical presentation, you know. So even if we're just taking the first level of suffering, so let's just take the first two levels. The level one is called the suffering of suffering, and one is called the suffering of change. Pretty straightforward. But the first one is what we mean by suffering. And basically, that's when the bad things happen. Very simple way to put it. We all know that when the bad things happen, that's exactly what we call suffering. And everybody else is the same, but we're talking about ourselves. Even if it's a mild bad thing, you know, that's called suffering. But the point about the second kind of suffering for the Buddha, it's so clear, but it's very shocking to us. He calls it the suffering of change, which sounds kind of boring, but what he's referring to is what we call happiness. And that seems, without explanation, that's pretty shocking. That sounds pretty depressing, you know, that what even we call happiness, which obviously we mean when the good things happen. In general, that's what we mean. When things are going nicely, it mightn't be very exciting, but you certainly wouldn't say you're suffering. And you'd say, oh, yes, I'm happy today. It's okay. Things are going, we'd say things are going well, which means that's what we mean by happiness. But Buddha's understanding of that happiness is much more subtle, is much more, it goes, he really gets us to question it. And he's telling us that actually it's a subtler level of suffering because it doesn't last. This is reason. It doesn't last, and it doesn't last, but it changes into the suffering of suffering. So now if we analyze that without even going into it too deeply yet, and I want to, because I said it's totally related to attachment and aversion. If we look at that, we can kind of agree, but it seems a bit depressing to hear it, you know? Because all we're wanting every day is the nice things, what we want to be. And that's what we mean by happiness. We want that every day. But then we hear, and that's what we mean by happiness. And we go over our lives and we can think of lots of instances of it. And we can recall this and we can even write them all down when the happy things happen, when I was happy. We'll go in, but then we'll hear that Buddha says, well, it's really a subtle level of suffering because it doesn't last. And then we're hearing that Buddha is indicating, it seems to me if we think of that, there's an indication in those words that Buddha is suggesting that there is some kind of happiness that does last. This is the point now. Think about it. Why would he tell us, well, it's not real happiness because it doesn't last? But if we look at our lives, we know there's no happiness that ever lasted. We know that. So he's not telling us yet, but any second we can hear it. It's an assumption in those words that actually he is suggesting that there is a type of happiness that will last. So it's kind of interesting. Now, if we hear this, if we're Christians, we know very well the answer is there is happiness and it's called being with God in heaven. So that's happiness that does last. That's how they talk. But in the ordinary world, day-to-day life, I think we can agree, even though it's depressing, that no happiness does last. But I think we don't question it. We never sort of look into it. We never sort of become so shocked and realize something changed. Well, let's see if there's a possibility that for happiness not to change. We always want it not to change. I think we have a very deep assumption that we're looking for happiness that doesn't last. Sorry, we are looking for happiness that lasts. I think it's instinctive in us. And then when something very wonderful happens, like you meet that amazing boyfriend, you're completely in love, you get the best job, you know, look how we talk. Finally, I've found happiness, we'll say. We always feel like we're looking for it. And when something magnificent happens, we now say the words, now I've got it. And we sort of believe, now I'm happy. We'll be happy forever. We assume that because we desperately want that. So then we look at our lives and we look at the lives of others. We literally do logical analysis. We are going to find there is no happy experience that has lasted, that hasn't changed into unhappiness. Because when he calls it the suffering of change, he means this happy feeling gradually turns into unhappy feelings. I mean, this sort of seems a bit clinical, but it's incredibly important to understand it. And it is quite clinical because Buddha's getting into his analysis, quite precise analysis of what happiness is, what the causes are, and how to get it, which is exactly what's implied in what is suffering, what are the causes, and how to get free of it. Because another way of putting getting free of suffering is to get happiness. It's another way of framing it, you know. So the fact of the matter is, Buddha is saying that he has found a method. He has found a method for achieving happiness, joy, fulfillment, all these words, whatever words you want by happiness. That's the thing, you know, we might say happiness. And when we say happiness, we tend to think of an external event. When something magnificent happens, you've got a new boyfriend, a new job, we think of it external, like it's a happy experience. But happiness really is referring to the mind. You know, we talk a lot about how there's different categories of states of mind. The negative, unhappy, painful ones, attachment, anger, jealousy. Then you've got the positive states of mind, love and compassion and kindness. Then you have this third category. I always call the mechanics of the mind. It sounds peculiar, but there are these states of mind in the Buddhist psychological analysis that are neither the negative neurotic ones nor the virtuous positive ones. So this is not a type of analysis we use in modern psychology. So we've got to think of it very freshly. But this is the very specific meaning in Buddhism. So a negative state of mind is one that's really, it's the voice of ego, it's fear-based, and it causes you pain and causes you to harm others. Positive states of mind are not painful, are not I-based, and they cause you happiness. And they cause you to help others be happy. So we understand that. If you're angry, we can see it hurts you and hurts others. If you're kind, we can see it helps you and helps others. So we get the difference, negative and positive, you know. But this third category of states of mind, they're things like concentration, good memory, and we can hear that they're not, they're just kind of necessary states of mind that anybody needs to do anything they do, whether it's good or bad. So a sniper would need very good concentration. A meditator needs very good concentration. You make a cake, you need good concentration. So these are the kind of, that's why I call them the mechanical parts of our mind. Well, in that category, oddly enough, this is a particular analysis. It's quite specific to Buddhism. And if we're interested to study it more, it'll help us understand our lives, you know. It's one of those is called feeling. Obviously, it's not referring to what we mean by an emotion. Hang on a sec, I've got to close my door. Put my robes on. I forgot I was half dressed. I should be respectful. Look like the Buddha when I teach. But behind me, he's wearing his robes. So, okay. So this one called feeling, there's only three kinds: happy feelings, pleasant feelings, unhappy feelings or unpleasant feelings. And the third one is kind of called neutral. Well, don't worry about them, okay? We're not, the ones we're worried about, the ones we're concerned with, the ones we think about all the time are the happy feelings and the unhappy feelings. So there can also be things called unhappy experiences, but this is all where karma comes in. You know, due to karma, bad things will happen, which trigger unhappy feelings. But really what we're talking when we talk about feeling, it's literally the mind. So pleasant feelings is the mind. Unpleasant feelings is the mind. So another way for saying pleasant feelings is called happiness. Happiness, you know. Okay, so This first kind of suffering. So, okay, within the mind, then we've got the negative, the positive, and the neutral, like we talk all the time. So within the first one, the negative ones, negative or non-virtuous are the ones that cause us, unpleasant feelings, and the ones that cause us to harm others. Well, as we all know, attachment, this primordial emotional hunger to always get the nice things, to get the pleasant feelings, to meet the situations that we believe will trigger nice feelings, to have everything go the way that we want so I can have pleasant feelings. So in other words, external event for us is a trigger of feelings. So those who want Mr. Trump to win, that'll be the external event that'll cause them to have very happy feelings. And if Kamala Harris wins, that'll cause people who attach to her to get pleasant feelings. So attachment is this emotional hunger, this craving, this neediness, and it's very fragile. It's not a very stable state of mind, because it's always anxious that it won't get what it wants. We know that. So attachment, basically, to get what we want, is what we think is the method to get happy feelings. And this is instinctive. Buddha says this is what he means by being in samsara, his term being in samsara. He says for lifetime after lifetime after lifetime of habit, this constant emotional hunger to get what I want, then we manipulate to get what I want, and that's why we harm others to get what we want. Look at the whole world, look at animals, look at humans. This is exactly how we live. We do whatever we do to get what we want, which is attachment. Why we want to get what attachment wants is because we think that will bring happy feelings. So the bottom line is we all want happy feelings, and we all don't want unhappy feelings. This is pretty primordial. And all really Buddha's saying that he's found that the methods that we use to get happy feelings, to get the cake or to harm others, aren't viable. They don't work. They don't last. And then you end up harming others as well, which brings more unhappy feelings in the future. So we've got happy feelings and unhappy feelings. So the analysis then, in terms of the mind, you see, Buddha says let's go to the second noble truth. He tells us there are causes of this suffering, the first kind of suffering, when the bad things happen, which brings unhappy feelings. That's called suffering. There are causes, Robina. And then the second kind of suffering, that we call happiness, we call the pleasant things happening, which trigger pleasant feelings. And why he calls them suffering, remember, is because they're temporary. They don't last. And eventually they die down. And before you know it, they have changed into unpleasant feelings. So it seems depressing, but if we do the analysis of our own lives, we will agree with absolute certainty that he's right. So then when we look at the causes of these two kinds of suffering, of course, he's got two main causes, he says. Two main causes. Two main causes. There are hundreds of causes, and many of them are external. There's no question. So when you get the cake, it triggers a pleasant feeling. So the cake is one of the causes. But our big problem, and we believe this totally, and he says we're totally mistaken, is that we think the main cause of happy feelings is the cake, the boyfriend, or getting what we want. And then we think when the bad thing happens, that we think the main cause of that too is the external world. And he's telling us, no, that's a mistake, he says. And this is quite hard to hear. He's saying the first cause of why a bad thing happens to you, let's say, you hurt your knee. Any moment, his analysis is any second of unpleasant feelings, any second of the first kind of suffering is the fruit of a seed planted in our mind in the past lives, when we did a negative action, when we did an action based on a delusion. We did an action, based on anger, let's say. You mightn't have harmed someone else, but you did a negative action driven by anger that drops a seed into your little mental bank vault, because the Buddha's basic view of karma is that every millisecond of what we think and do and say doesn't go astray. It programs us. It drops seeds in the mind. So each moment in this life of an unpleasant feeling, even minor, tiny, small, which means suffering, the first kind of suffering, is the fruit of a past negative action. That's the very first cause, he says. And then the second cause of that is the delusion, the anger, let's say, in this case, that drove us to do that action. But then that seed goes into the mind, programmed, and then it ripens, this life, something seemingly random happens, and you get some pain, you get some sickness, So that would be called the environmental result of past killing, actually, because different actions have different results. But never mind that. It mightn't have to be that much. But never mind. So each moment, Buddha's saying karma is the first cause of suffering. And also karma is the first cause of happiness too. And then second is the delusion in the mind that made us do the action. Or every moment of happiness, it's the fruit of a virtuous action. So basically, this is where Buddha really puts his very clear mark on it. This is where the view of karma comes in and the way the mind works, because karma is the law that plays out in the minds and lives of sentient beings. So because there's no such thing as a creator, Buddha says, no such thing as random, something can't be random. He says this is a natural law that every millisecond, or whatever we think and do and say, is the fruit of what we thought and did and said before. And every millisecond what we experience is the fruit of what we've done before. So in other words, we are literally our own creators. And of course, this is a huge idea. We might be Buddhists for 50 years, but it's really hard to apply this because it doesn't feel this way. It doesn't appear this way. It doesn't seem like this at all. So it's a pretty big one. So, okay, when it gets to two main causes of suffering, karma and delusions, then this gets us to the mind. Delusions is the mind. And delusions is the name for the first category of states of mind, the neurotic ones, the deluded ones, the I-based ones, the negative ones, the non-virtuous ones, the ones that cause us pain. So then if we take these first kinds of suffering, one, the suffering of suffering when the bad things happen, and two, the suffering of change, which is when the good things happen, we can relate these experiences directly in our daily life to attachment and aversion. Attachment and aversion. So attachment, as we talk, is this deeply instinctive, totally in the bones of our being. It's at the level of assumption every second, driving us all automatically to, it wants nice things to happen. It's automatic. Wants nice things to happen. It wants pleasant feelings. It wants pleasant feelings. And then the millisecond we don't get pleasant feelings, the millisecond an unpleasant feeling arises. That's what triggers aversion, anger. So we have attachment and we have anger. Attachment and aversion. Aversion is simply the bare bones state of mind that arises, that can be volatile anger or can be more mild, such as annoyed, irritated, upset, frustrated. They're all polite words for mild anger. And then even despair and depression when they're built up internally. So otherwise, in any day, any second, we are continually running between attachment and aversion. Attachment and aversion. Attachment is driving us to meet nice situations, is driving us to avoid unnice situations, is assuming I must somehow, it's a very strong, there's a strong component of very self-centered about attachment. It's kind of like the hubris. When something when it really is strong, there's this kind of hubris that I somehow deserve happiness. And that only really arises when we notice it, when we don't get the nice things. How dare that happen? I don't deserve it, we will say. That's anger. That's how anger sounds. How dare that happen? How dare you do that to me? I don't deserve it. So that assumes that attachment thinks we do deserve happy feelings. This, I think, is very strong. This needs really looking at into our minds. It's very strong in our mind. So that's what we have to analyze. I mean, this is one thing to analyze. And Buddha says, the Buddha's view is it's a bizarre idea. What do you mean you deserve? What do you mean you don't deserve? Because when we say, so I think when we analyze it, you look carefully, when we say how dare, even if you stub your toe, how dare that happen? Kind of like feel I don't deserve that pain, you know, as if somehow someone sort of did it to you. So in other words, when we say I deserve happiness, think about that. When we say I deserve happiness, we kind of mean somebody should give me happiness. It should come from somewhere else. I use this simple example of if you've got a garden, you never say when you go outside and look in your garden, why are there no flowers in my garden? I deserve flowers. It's really clear the meaning. You'd never say that because the simple reason is you own the garden as yours and you know that it's not the job of anybody but you to put flowers there. So you'd never say, I deserve flowers. So then when we do say, I deserve happiness, I deserve this, it's because we assume, and this is what Buddha's pointing out to us, a total mistake, we assume it comes from the outside. We assume it's somebody else's job somehow to make me happy. So it's very self-piteous and it's very ill-placed because it's not logical. He says it's not logical. There's no one's job to make you happy. No one's created you. Your mother didn't make you. Your father didn't make you. God didn't, people didn't, somebody made you. Everything we experience, we created. So that's why I like to say our life is like our garden. Then we learn to own all the things that happen to us, the bad things, which are like the weeds, we must have planted them. No one put them there. And the good things, we must have planted them. No one put them there. It's simple, but it's a very profound analysis, a very profound analogy. It's very simple. Because the voice of ego is innocent victims. Self-pity me. I didn't ask to get born. It's not my fault. How dare that happen to me? I deserve happiness. I don't deserve suffering. And this is not being mean to us. Have a look at how the whole world suffers. So the Buddha is basically saying it's a complete misconception. Ego's made this up. It's a series of misconceptions deep in the bones of our being, you know. So we assume we just somehow deserve the good things to happen. And this is the point when we look at it more deeply. We don't think it's got anything to do with me. We don't think it's my job to have to plant the flowers. We somehow think if we just sit there and someone should put flowers there, it's their job, you know. And then how dare they come along and put weeds in our ground? It's very, very weird, actually, but that's how we believe, that's how we live our lives. So then you look at it, anger, it's exactly that one of how dare you do that to me, I don't deserve it. That's the nature of anger. How dare that happen to me? I don't deserve it. And I'm not criticizing us. What Buddha is telling us literally is these states of mind, these assumptions are why we suffer. So this is not meant to criticize us, which should make us cry with compassion for ourselves. Buddha is giving us his analysis of why we suffer. Past harming others, and then anger and attachment and the other delusions. They are the cause, you know. So that means in any one day, working with our attachment, working with our anger are huge practices. Sounds so cute always, but they're huge practices. And that means with attachment, giving up this fearful anxiety of the bad thing happening, of Mr. Trump, let's say, if we don't like Mr. Trump, of Mr. Trump getting elected. And then you're going to see all the uncontrolled people in the world with all the conspiracy theories and all the dramas built on top of that bare bones attachment. All the stories and drama. This is exactly why people have wars, divorces, harm each other. We can't. So we build up all this rationale, you know. All the dramas come from these two. It's so obvious, you know. So then, given how to practice daily life, given that we can't guarantee that what I want every day will happen, then giving up attachment, one of the practices of giving up attachment is to develop the courage to not be afraid of the opposite. Not to be afraid of the opposite, you know. Some people are so freaked out. Americans even are leaving the United States to live somewhere else because they can't stand the pain anymore. They're imagining it's getting worse and it's going to be horrible. So they're literally leaving. That's fine. You can make that decision anytime. You can. It doesn't matter. But if we're not going to decide to suddenly leave our home and go somewhere else, then we have to learn to practice this way. Then the interesting point is, this is what we don't believe, but it's true. When we give up this fear and attachment of the bad thing happening, if it does happen, it won't be so bad. That's the point. That's the point. That's very hard to believe, but that's true. That's why, if I use the example of my friends in prison, these courageous people who have been forced to do this job of giving up attachment and having the courage to greet the problem. When you greet the problem, not live in fear of it, when you greet the problem, when you greet the thing you don't want to happen, when you greet it, then you're looking it in the eye. Therefore, there's less fear. Therefore, there is less fear. This is absolute logic. Oh, and always simple examples. You know, we do this in our lives. I always give the example of that time I got held up with a gun by someone in New York, you know. It has happened this way. I'm not trying to say I'm so clever. A situation where we can think it could be quite traumatic. You know, someone's got a gun in your chest. This guy, the young guy, this is back in mid-70s, doesn't matter. But I was in in lower Manhattan, 2 in the morning. I hadn't been in New York very long. I had no idea about all the fears of violence. I was down the Lower East Side, and this out of the blue, this fellow came with a gun, you know, with me and my sister. Give me your money, bitch, he said, you know, I'll never forget. Young guy had a gun in my breast, you know, right between my breasts. It was it was a bit of a comedy because we'd just come from this Irish bar, me and my sister. And my sister Jan was into shoplifting. And so she stole the glass of wine and she's walking home with this glass of wine. And it's so hilarious. He's saying to me, give me your money, bitch. You know, and Jan kept saying, hey, brother, have some wine. Brother, have some wine, brother, have some wine. I mean, like ridiculous, you know. And I mean, what happened for me, whatever reason, my nature, I got angry with him, you know. I got shocked. I started giving me a lecture. I swore at him. Who do you think you are? How dare you? I said, and I kept seeing the logic of it. It was so ridiculous. I said, you know, excuse me, we're just as poor as you. You give me your money. Oh, it was so ridiculous to me. I was shocked, you know, completely shocked. But it just happened that way. So in the end, I won, you know, I won the day. He went away, all kind of like he went away. He gave up. So because of that, and that's all I'm saying is the teaching here, for whatever reason, that's how I dealt with it. There was no fear. And because there was no fear, I had no suffering. I did not suffer. I did not have PTSD. I promise you, I didn't have to go to a therapist and work on it and still be 45 years later worrying about people at nighttime with guns. No, I'm giving an example. I didn't plan it like that. It just happened. But I learned from it. I learned from it, you know. And we can all see in our lives, and this is no, we can't. It's very hard to see this. Because we all totally believe when the bad things happen, that's why I suffer. So Buddha's not totally saying that's wrong. Definitely the stubbing of your toe is a catalyst for that pain in your body, which is called suffering. It is definitely true. But we think the main cause of the pain is the stubbing, is the chair you bumped into. No. The main cause of it is your past non-virtuous action that ripened as that moment as a pain. So the main cause is your past action. And then then your mind at this moment having aversion to it. So even if you practice Don't wait till you're held up with a gun. Don't wait until there's a war zone in the United States. But learn to notice the attachment not getting what it wants when you stub your toe, when your boyfriend doesn't do the right thing, when the thing doesn't work, when the bad weather. Any tiny event, don't wait for the bad things. Each moment of the day is an opportunity to see attachment and then see the aversion when it doesn't get what it wants. And then you do the analysis and you learn from it. This is daily Dharma practice. And this is the method to stop suffering. Slowly, slowly, to get happy. Okay, now ask me some questions. In other words, the whole thing's quite technical. It's a technical explanation. And I find it very fascinating and very viable. You look at it and we can see it, we can prove it to be, we can work with it. It's workable, you know, but it's just hard work because we'd rather get angry. We'd rather blame. We'd rather feel like a victim. It's very instant. That's the irony of ego, you know. Ego is a self-pity. So ask me some questions, please. Anything at all. What do you think? Yes, Cyril.
Hello,
Yes,
dear
Cyril.
Venerable. Thank you for the teachings. So I would like to know concerning mindfulness and concentration. It is some neutral.
It's neither negative nor positive
Yes,
state of
it's kind of mechanical stuff, but it
that's
looks like the result of concentration is like bliss, which is a virtuous result.
that's two different things. So what it is, the action of concentration, the name of the state of mind called concentration is neither negative nor positive, but the action of concentration, developing it, can trigger very pleasant feelings. Well, so can a chocolate cake. So that was the action of concentration, which itself is not virtuous or non-virtuous, but that is what then triggers in the mind the ability to feel very joyful. So the joy is one state of mind, the concentration is another. In the same, but they're not the concentration isn't the direct cause of the pleasure. In the same way that the cake is the trigger for the pleasant feeling, but the cake is not the main cause of the pleasant feeling. Those pleasant feelings that the meditator experiences when they get concentration is the fruit of past virtuous actions ripening as pleasure. Do you understand?
Yes, thank you. So it does mean that when we practice concentration, we do not create virtue, or it depends also on the motivation while doing the.
It only depends on the motivation. It solely depends on the motivation.
So, for
Solely.
example, if I practice concentration for 20 minutes with motivation which is virtuous, which can be, for example, increasing. So
That makes it a virtuous action. Yes, that makes it a virtuous action.
okay, so it's a virtuous, it becomes a virtuous action.
Yes, because of the motivation. That's exactly.
And okay, thank you very much, Venerable. Thank you.
That's a good point. Thank you, Cyril. Anybody else, dear people? Questions? I mean, what I said is quite technical, but it's good. I mean, to squeeze our brain a little bit, to analyze carefully these things is really, really helpful. Don't just be emotional about it, you know. It's really helpful to understand. Then we can work on the mind and we know what to do, you know. It's like learning the recipe of a cake. It's not just a nice feeling. You got to learn how to do it. Same here, you know. What are the questions, people? Anybody? Nothing else there? No?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, Kelly. Hello, sweetheart.
Hello, Venerable. Thank you very much.
Good, good.
Always good stuff. So let me tackle this one. So I'm curious. So one of the things I've been exploring lately is the difference between boundary setting, which is kind of crazy. I mean, I don't know, it feels a little bit crazy. But sometimes it feels necessary. So the difference between how do we discern when we're validly for self-love establishing a boundary versus because it feels like sometimes when that arises, there's a little bit of aversion, a little bit of irritation. So how do we discern between, well, is this really just suffering?
I
Or
understand that. No, we have to
yeah,
have common. It's really, wisdom is a very grand word, but a simple way of saying wisdom is common sense. So if you get too close to a snake that will bite you because that's its nature, then you need to have very clear boundaries between you and the snake. That's not foolish, that's intelligence. You know, so you are, first you understand your capacity, and second you understand the nature of the snake, so you act appropriately to avoid being bitten by the snake. So if you're with certain human beings whom from your side, no, from their side, they mightn't have very many problems, but from your side, you might have strong problems, a lot of attachment, a lot of fear, a lot of jealousy, a lot of anger. You've got to recognize where you are at, and then act accordingly to the other person. And if you can't, if they ring you up every day and want to have a cup of tea with you, but you can't stand it, not out of selfishness, but out of intelligence and appropriate behavior, you have to say no. So you have to know your own capability. That's the main thing. And then with the best motivation possible, not just following anger, you say no. You have to be intelligent. And our big problem in life is we have no sense of our boundaries because we have no sense of our own awareness, and because we're full of attachment and want to be loved by everybody, and then we get hurt and then we blame people. But we've got to have wisdom, we've got to have intelligence, Do you understand? I mean, you could argue with my experience with the gunman. If I'd learned about it, I would have learned back then in New York City that you don't walk around at 2 a.m. in the Lower East Side. I was inviting problems, and indeed I got problems. It happened to be I dealt with it. That would have been a common sense type of approach to it. But I didn't check. You understand? You understand my point?
I,
The key thing is to know what you're capable of, and then not out of aversion or anger to that person. You would out of common sense, and I can't cope with more. So that can come to being your mother, your grandmother, even your ex-boyfriend, anybody. If you can't handle it, if you're not capable, you have to make a wise decision to keep away. Do you understand?
I understand.
Very important.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that makes total sense.
That's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Good, Kelly.
Okay, if there's time, may I ask a second question?
Absolutely, darling.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so the other thing, so independent arising fits nicely into these first two, the causes of suffering. So I'm curious, I've been following this chocolate cake analogy. I have been, and I'm, observing behaviors, being very mindful. So I'm looking specifically at my addiction to cigarettes. That terrible thing, and I have health issues, it just runs the gamut. Anyhow, so how do so using that as an example, or chocolate cake, obviously there's a positive feeling. Is that what you would say? That attachment is imbuing, like how can we be aware, but we're still doing the same thing?
I know, darling. Kelly, that's why we have to understand that certain objects
Mhm.
of attachment for different people, because attachment, you see, attachment, the simplest way to put it, attachment really is another word for addiction.
Yeah.
Attachment is this constant craving. And depending on the karma we have, it could be for money, it could be for cake, it could be for people to love me, it could be for anything, it could be for killing, So yours happens to be for an object called cigarettes. I know all about it. I used to smoke like a chimney. So the problem is attachment, but there's the added problem, as we know, that phenomenon called cigarettes can also cause us physical suffering. So at alcohol, the problem is attachment, but the physical thing called alcohol can cause incredible problems. So, you could argue that cake is also going to cause you just to get fat, but some people might have addiction to cake, but never get fat. So they could even have more addiction than most people, but they don't not happen to get fat. So always the thing to first look at is the attachment. And then it happens to be that some things we get attached to can cause us harm. So it's just habit. Attachment really is just habit, darling. And so then it does, so that, and that, of course, as we know, I mean, I know with cigarettes and any of those strong objects, I know when I was addicted to cigarettes, when we analyze it, the habit's so inbuilt that the fear of not getting the cigarette is almost worse than anything. You can't stand the thought. I mean, because physically it does have this result. If you don't get the cigarette, the physical, the tension and the craving is so strong, isn't it? Mental and physical. It's so strong. And it feels like it's unbearable that we can't bear the pain, which is why we go to the next cigarette. So then, it's like, I mean, I'm not saying you have to give up cigarettes, but I mean, there's an implication in what you're saying that you're trying to give them up, or you want to give them up, or you think you should give them up. Is that right?
Yes. I think
Yeah.
yes,
So-
there's that
So
karmic.
somehow, I know. So then part of the process is it's like giving up anything, giving up attachment is incredibly painful because itself is addiction. We are into the same, we kind of got, the mind is dug in these grooves, and the thought of not having the cake, the thought of not having the cigarette, the thought of not being close to that person, the thought of not doing that activity, the thought of not looking at my video, the thought of whatever it might be it like causes us panic, so we have to do that thing. So you got to, if you want to try, I mean, I'm sure you've tried dozens, there must be dozens of approaches. But the thing is, one of the things is to learn, to know that, yes, the pain is awful when you don't have the cigarette, but that it's possible to handle it. It's possible to develop you've got to be encouraging yourself to know that you can develop a new habit. And then but there's that period in between where it's very, very, very painful. So it's having a bit of a long-term view and having the courage. This is all part of it. Whatever method you end up using to get rid of it, to stop the addiction, it is possible. It is possible. So we'd have to have and that's where whether it's attachment to having Kamala Harris and not Mr. Trump tomorrow, and the thought of the panic of having the wrong person. It's the same with the cigarette, but it's just a different level of it. So to know that we can bear the pain of the panic and the aversion and the stress, it is possible to be able to do it, but to have the conviction that it won't last, that you can change, and eventually the pain will go away. So you've got to look forward to that. That's the courage we need. We can look forward to the relief from the addiction, and I mean not the physical need. Do you understand? So whatever method you use, but you understand, because really it's attachment very strong, whether it's to that boyfriend or to do the action we want to do, it almost feels impossible not to do it. It almost feels, and that's why when addiction is so strong and you don't have access to the virtues in your mind, that's when it's impossible to give it up, because you just don't believe, it wouldn't even occur to you. I mean, there's a guy when I go for walks in New York City, he's a complete, what are those heavy duty drugs that people on the street? What are those terrible drugs? Crystal, whatever those things are. This,
Yes.
you can see is a sweet boy. He's as skinny as a rake, teeth missing, totally a junkie. Totally a junkie, I look him in the eye, I see him all the time. And even to suggest the possibility that one day you might think of giving it up is literally impossible. His eyes just glaze over because the intensity of the addiction is so overwhelming and destroying him mentally and physically. So you can see when you're at that level, it's pretty hard to give it up. But but if we've got our sanity and we have intelligence and we have courage, we can. But don't torture yourself, one step at a time, Kelly. You understand what I'm saying? Good, darling. So I don't think we need to have an hour and a half today. I'm going to give you an hour, which is over now. So any other questions? Yes, Cyril.
Yes, thank you, Venerable. So I have another question relating to attachment. So, for example, when some external event happen and we have some joy or pleasant feeling, it's very difficult to notice the delusion, because we are maybe following the pleasure, and we are concerned with the object, and
What's the question? What's the
so
question?
how
Sorry.
to notice the delusion when something very, very pleasant happen, we are just
You can't do it on,
enjoying.
you can't do it at the time. You have to practice. So it's like asking, what will I do when I crash my car? If you haven't practiced driving, you won't have the tools. So your ability to see your mind when a very bad thing or very good thing happens is dependent upon your previous practice. So practice. Practice is the answer. You get into the habit. You understand?
Okay,
Good.
thank you, Davina.
Sweethearts, I think an hour is good enough. That was enough food for thought there. Yes, people, think about it carefully. And let's see what happens on November the 5th, the United States. Whatever it is, just keep working on our minds and get up in the morning and do our practice and have our breakfast and be kind to the dog and go to sleep and keep moving. Do what we can in this crazy world. Do what we can. Thank you, people. Happy to see you all. Thank you, Sheila. See you, sweetheart.